Hello, welcome to 30 Minutes. I'm Rick Anthony. The title of today's program could be Yippies to Yuppies in One Generation to describe the demographic cohort born between 1946 and 1964, usually referred to as the baby boomer generation. The generation that changed virtually every aspect of our culture, some say not for the better. More than 460,000 of them attended the iconic Woodstock Rock Festival in 1969, and they marched in great numbers in the Vietnam War protests of the 1960s and 1970s. They were the disruptive generation. By the 1980s, their profile was changed. They're evolving from yippie to yuppie, young, upwardly mobile urban professionals who were obsessively materialistic workaholics. Fast forward. Today, more than 10,000 boomers turn age 65 every day. And by 2030, all surviving boomers will be at least age 65. But their legacy lives on. In his new book, Triumph of the Yuppies, America, the 80s, and the Creation of the Unequal Nation, award-winning journalist and author Tom McGrath chronicles the roots, the rise, the triumph, and seemingly the fall of the young urban professionals who radically altered America between 1980 and 1987. The book has been described as a portrait of America just as it was beginning to come apart. Tom, welcome to 30 Minutes.
Thanks. Thanks for having me.
Delighted to have you because this subject has been of personal interest to me, having written about and taught a course on the intergenerational workforce. So I read excerpts from your book, and I'll be interested to see the conclusions you come to and the reasons for those conclusions. So let's begin with, your book has been described as the first in-depth analysis of the baby boomer generation, the yuppie generation, I should say. Why does your book stand out from everything else that's been written about baby boomers? And there's a ton.
Yeah, there is a ton about baby boomers. Nothing, interestingly, has really focused on the yuppie phase of the baby boomer generation.
Really?
So that's one of the reasons I was interested in this. But I think one of the other ways it's different from other baby boomer books is it really tries to take a look at the divide in the baby boom generation. I mean, we tend to think of baby boomers in a broad scopes, right? This was the generation that protested in the 60s and was sort of into the me generation in the 70s. And that was definitely true, but that's kind of a minority of the generation. Something like 40% of baby boomers went to college, so most of the generation does not have a college degree. And that sort of more working class part of the generation, I think, tends to get sort of glossed over or lumped together. And one of the things I try and talk about in the book is that, no, there's a real economic and I think ultimately cultural divide between those two parts of the generation. That yuppiness, writing about yuppies is a way of sort of talking about that divide.
But did the non-college part of the boomers have as much impact as the 40% that went to college?
I'd say probably not. Now, like the entire generation sort of is caught up in lots of social change, right? That's not exclusive just to the well-educated part. But one of the things I talk about in the book is that economically, the country is really driven by that college-educated half of the baby boomer generation. And they end up really building an economy that benefits other college-educated people, but kind of says to the non-college people, well, good luck, we'll hope you can find something to do. And I think that's partly where we are, that's what we've been dealing with over the last 40 years, and I think where we are now economically as a country.
You're a professional writer, you've written other books. Once again, why this? What was there an event, circumstance that prompted you to spend 2+ years of your life writing this book?
So I was in college when the yuppie phenomenon was happening. It means I was probably a little bit too young and certainly didn't have enough money at that point to actually be a yuppie. But I was very conscious of what was happening. And it's at a time in my life when you're kind of impressionable and things make an impact on you. So I've always been interested in the period. And I think I've gotten more interested in it in the last decade or so as the economy has changed, or I think we've seen the divide in the economy. And I started kind of linking these two things together, that you have income inequality that's at a century-long high in America. And I think, well, part of that really starts in the 1980s, and a way to sort of get at how we ended up here is to go back and tell this story of baby boomers and specifically yuppies. So that really was kind of the motivating force for why I wanted to write about this.
Is the book more a history or is it a socioeconomic study?
It's
or both.
It's probably both. I think the way I was thinking of it was really I wanted to tell the story of how we got where we are and really tell the story of it too. I mean, I deliberately wrote this as a narrative with some characters that are highlighted, and it's set in a very specific time period between 1980 and 1987, because I want the reader to sort of relive this period, or if you were not born yet, to understand what it felt like to be part of this period, right. Because I think that to me is a more powerful way to get ideas across rather than just a straight essay or something that's so I really thought about it as story. So yeah, I think partly it is history and partly it's sociology and partly a lot of other stuff in there as well.
According to your thesis, did the rest of the country embrace the narcissism of the baby boomers? Or did they resist it? Did they resent it?
That's a really interesting question, because one of the things that was true about yuppiness almost from the very beginning when yuppies were first sort of identified in the media is that there was kind of an eye roll about them. There's sort of satiric books that were written about yuppies, and that sort of satire and eye roll eventually kind of becomes a real backlash against yuppiness. And so by the time yuppiness, the stock market crashes in 1987 and yuppies are pronounced dead, no one is shedding a tear over this. But the ironic thing is that a lot of what yuppies stood for in terms of putting themselves first, in terms of creating an economy that works well for people of a certain type, all that lives on. So people may have said, "Oh, I can't stand yuppies," and yet yuppie ideals and yuppie values, I think, are still very much with us.
Was the millennial generation and the values of the millennials and those who followed the yuppies a backlash?
I think to some extent.
Overreaction to everything that had preceded?
I mean, I think one generation is always to some extent rebelling against the one that came before it. I mean, baby boomers, yuppies were rebelling against, in many ways, the silent generation or the greatest generation before them. I think millennials, the backlash in part was political, right? I mean, you see a lot of millennials that have moved pretty far to the left and have focused on things like income inequality and certainly climate change in a way that previous generation really didn't, at least broadly speaking. So yeah, I think millennials are in some ways a backlash to baby boomers and yuppies. But at the same time, we are generalizing, right? You can always find examples where that's not the case.
But if we do live in cycles, what will the next cycle be?
Well, I have two kids who are Gen Z, which is the next generation after that. And, I think some of this, it takes a little time to see it too, right? I mean, you can be one thing when you're 18 years old and a very different thing by the time you're 35 or 40. So I think it's going to take a little bit of time to sort of play out exactly what millennials fully become as they now are in their 40s.
Well, with the benefit of hindsight, do the boomers come off any better than they have been portrayed in the past?
I think these things are always complicated. I mean, I think there are some, broadly speaking, downsides to boomers, but boomers were also, they're probably the most entrepreneurial generation that we've had in American history, and I think that's a good thing. The tech revolution, which we could probably have a long conversation about how good and how bad that is, that's really mostly driven by boomers. I mean, Steve Jobs is a boomer, Bill Gates is a boomer. I mean, that really drives a lot of the technological change that we've had. And I think a lot of the general questioning of things that boomers have brought to the table, well, it cuts both ways. It can be, destabilizing in some ways, but some things deserve to be questioned as well. So it's always hard to come down black and white on particularly on a large thing like a generation, right?
Politically, boomers did represent, for the most part, a more conservative. Is that true in your opinion?
Well, it kind of depends where, I would say generally, this is a generation that, at least a slice of them start out really far to the left, right? Yes. They're sort of radicals and activists against the war.
Then they grew up and they had to pay taxes.
Right. So that's certainly part of what happens. And, a fair number of boomers become Democrats, but they like a version of the Democratic Party that is very different from the Democratic Party of the 1960s or even the 1970s. So there are, I think where a lot of boomers end up is that they're economically conservative, but socially liberal. So they like low taxes, they like free trade, but they're pro-choice, they're pro-gay rights, and there's a lot of boomers, I think, fit that profile.
You mentioned Jerry, not just mentioned, you devote a lot of space to Jerry Rubin and some other luminaries of the time. Why those particular people? Rubin, who was
Rubin is
reactionary, and so on, then who became a very successful entrepreneur and investor.
Yeah, Rubin is really he's a fascinating character. So he was one of the sort of leaders of the anti-war movement in the '60s and the counterculture. And then in the '70s, he got
a haircut.
Well, before he gets a haircut, he gets involved in sort of the me movement. He's looking inward, all that stuff, and then by the late '70s and into the early '80s, he then kind of reinvents himself as a capitalist. And one of the reasons I wanted to write about him is that as a character, he's interesting, but he was also really a spokesman for yuppiness. I mean, he really is out there pounding the drum for things like, business networking and success and achievement. I mean, he articulates a lot of the values that other people were embracing at that particular moment. So just as a character in a story, he's really interesting. But I also focus on a couple of other characters in the book. Jack Welch, the former CEO of GE, is a character in the book.
Who was loved and hated.
Exactly, yeah. And this book is a little bit broader than just Yuppies. I'm also talking about changes that happened in corporate America. And Welch was really a great way to talk about how corporate America changed. And the focus went from to really just serving stockholders as opposed to equally serving shareholders, employees, communities. I mean, Welch very much put the focus just on the bottom line. And I write a lot about Michael Milken.
Wait.
Sure.
He did that, though, because he had to turn the company around.
That's not true. The company was doing fine. GE was one of the 10 largest companies in the world in 1981 when he took over.
Was on a trajectory that was not very good at the time.
Well, I'm not sure that's
then
correct.
Why did he break it up?
He thought it was undervalued. So there's a difference between thinking it's undervalued and thinking it's struggling. So no, his whole thing was that he wanted to serve shareholders, and he didn't care about the impact of anything else. And he's not the only one doing this. I'm not saying he's the only person that way. But to me, he was symbolic of what was happening in corporate America. So that's one of the reasons I wanted to focus on him. And then one of the other characters in the book is Michael Milken, because there are obviously a lot of changes that are happening on Wall Street in the 1980s as well. And Milken, again, is a fascinating character and really was a revolutionary when it came to finance in America.
And then he changed. He had an epiphany.
Well, he got convicted.
Well, once he came out of jail.
But he came out of jail with probably $1 billion. It wasn't like he was in the poorhouse and had some spiritual awakening. I mean, to his credit, he has certainly been incredibly generous as a philanthropist, focused a lot on healthcare and so forth. But he's really a fascinating character.
And a third?
Those are really, I think, Rubin, Milken, and Welch are probably the three biggest characters. Now, there are lots of other minor characters in the book that pop up because, again, I'm really trying to tell a story and latch on to some of the personalities that were part of this.
Well, what's the overriding theme of the book? Well, as you say, you address social aspects, the political aspects, the economic aspects. What's the overarching theme of the book?
I really do think it comes back to this idea of the country starting to split apart along economic and educational and cultural lines. And you have, the 50s and 60s and to some extent the 70s are known. That's the rise of the middle class in the United States, that booming post-war period where incomes are rising across the board. Everybody is benefiting from this growing economy. And we get to the 80s, that stops. The economy continues to grow, but it's growing mostly for those people at the very top and sort of leaving behind a large chunk of the country. And so partly the story is about the economics of that. Partly it's also about the cultural impact of that. The way yuppies kind of dictate tastes when it comes to everything from food to the fitness revolution to high-end luxury products. I mean, those are all sort of, a lot of those things really have their roots in this period that I'm writing about.
When did the country, culturally, become less spiritual? Not necessarily religious, but less spiritual?
I think baby boomers would certainly be the sort of first wave of that. I mean, it's very much continued among the millennial generation and the next generations after that. And why that is, that's a really interesting question. I don't know. I don't know if it's a more affluent country naturally leads people away from a more deeper spiritual or religious experience, or whether it's the questioning of institutions that pull people away from religion.
A few years ago, I taught a course, college-level course on the intergenerational workforce. I thought fascinating as I studied each of the generations. And I postulated at the time that we as a country, as a culture, as a society, would see open conflict between the older folks and the younger folks. Fights, conflicts over limited resources, healthcare, housing, which we're seeing, just standard of living. And other people said, you're crazy, it'll never happen in this country. We'll never have that kind of divide. And you say?
Well, housing is certainly a good example, right? I mean, the housing crisis that we're in right now is in part about people who've had a house and are older, and then we don't have enough houses. I guess part of my response to your thesis, which I think is interesting, though, is that are all those resources finite? I mean, we can build more houses, and we should build more houses. That's the solution to the housing crisis. We just have reasons that we haven't built more houses. We can have as much health care as we want to have. We just need to figure out a way to pay for it. So, I mean, I think your thesis is interesting, but I'm not sure if I agree with the premise of it.
Well, wait a minute. You said will. And so there has to be a will to allocate resources to solve the problems.
Okay.
We don't have the political will in this country to solve the problems. I mentioned to you before we started this visit, this morning's in Journal, front page article on the plight of caregivers. As a former caregiver myself, I can relate to it. This relates to the boomers because the boomers are getting older and they're living longer with multiple morbidities and they require care. With 43 million caregivers in this country who are suffering, really suffering. 15% of them have maybe more than that, hold full-time jobs and are trying to balance that. The cost of caring for a care-dependent adult at home is now almost $300,000. People don't have that kind of money.
Yeah.
We don't have a solution to that. We don't have the will to solve the problem. I think part of the reason is the problem really hasn't been brought to the consciousness of the country. They suffer really quite silently. Nonetheless, it's a consequence of the boomer generation living longer. Thank God healthcare is now helping us live longer. But oh my God, now what do we do?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Do you address any of the consequences of the boomer generation and the yuppie generation?
Not specifically. I mean, the story I'm telling
So
more
there's
or
no
less.
trajectory after this.
I mean, what I focus on more in sort of the last chapter of the book sort of takes us up to the present, but it doesn't necessally get into, I mean, some of the caregiving issues that you're talking about.
For example.
I do talk about the fact that sort of what I would think of as the people who were yuppies in the 1980s have more or less evolved into this kind of generally comfortable upper middle class, or even sometimes more wealthier than that, sort of elite, right? And they've done fine at the same time that even some of their brethren as baby boomers, and these are some of the folks I think you're talking about that now need ongoing care but can't afford it, have not done as well as they did. So it's not specifically about the caregiving crisis, but I think you could sort of you don't have to dig too far in before you.
Well, there's another aspect to it. There's not just the caregivers, but again, how many retirees, yuppies, now have to take second and third jobs because their retirement income isn't nearly enough.
I think that's true. Probably not true for people who were yuppies, because I think most of them are fairly comfortable. But for people who were more working class or middle class, I think that's absolutely the case. Because I mean, they were not able to save enough along the way. Right?
Well, they were able to save enough until they changed the rules of the game. Inflation, cost of housing, et cetera, et cetera. They planned for it. They would have had enough money. You know, what was the rule? You have to have at least $1 million saved in order to live a reasonably comfortable life. $1 million doesn't go as far as it used to.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think so. But I think there's a large number of people, from everything I've read, in terms of retirement savings. I mean, it's nowhere close to $1 million that most people have saved. Right?
Yeah. Where did the word yuppie come from? And the word yippie?
So Yippie, I can give you the answer to. Yuppie is a harder question. So Yippie came from, it stood for the Youth International Party, which was something that was formed by Jerry Rubin and his buddy Abby Hoffman and a couple of other people in 1968. Where Yuppie came from is kind of a mystery. The first time it appears to have been used in print was in 1980 in an article in Chicago Magazine that was really writing about the gentrification of some neighborhoods in Chicago. And it used the phrase yuppie, young urban professional. So that was used by a writer named Dan Rottenberg, actually a Philadelphia-based writer.
Yeah.
He was writing for Chicago. And I called Dan and I said, hey, did you invent this word? And he said, no, it was sort of in the air, at least in Chicago in 1980. And so he was like, I used it, but I didn't invent it. And despite all the digging I did, I cannot find where exactly it came from. And it took a couple of years even after Dan used it before it became really popular. But he gets the credit at least for using it first. But where it came from before that, whether it was a real estate term, whether it was a marketing term, whether it was some smart aleck in a bar, I don't know.
Well, it's good alliteration as well. Yippee, yuppie.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Yeah.
Some novelists, some authors have told me that when they write, they know where they're going. They've written the last chapter and then they write backwards. Now, that's true of novelists. Was that true in your case as well? Did you know you were going to end on the stock crash in 1982?
I did, and I think that's true. It's definitely true of novelists. I think it's true of nonfiction, particularly when you're telling a story, right?
Yeah,
you need to know where does the story end, so I know where it starts.
This is a narration, as you said before.
Right. So to me, it felt like a logical ending point. I wanted to end there for a couple reasons. One, it's a logical ending point for the yuppie phenomenon. There were literally obituaries written for yuppies, tongue-in-cheek, after the stock market crashed. But to me, it's also an ironic ending because, as I point out in this sort of final chapter, which is kind of an afterword, the word yuppie went away. We don't use it very much anymore these days. But all the things that yuppies stood for, they didn't go away at all. And so many of those same values and qualities that yuppies embraced did not end in 1987, and they're very much still with us today. So it's kind of one of those, it's the end of yuppies, but it's not really the end of yuppies.
So there is not yet, a word to describe this generation of narcissists, materialistic, workaholics, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, that might include a lot of people, right? It's not purely generational,
It bothers me, the Thursday edition of the Journal, Wall Street Journal, the last section is always mansions.
Right.
I can't read it. I really can't.
You don't even enjoy the voyeuristic part of it?
No, I don't relish, participate, share in the joy of all these wonderful people with more money than they know what to do with, because they represent such a tiny percentage of our population, with the rest of the population, not all obviously, but significant numbers, not enjoying that affluence, the comfort of that lifestyle. It just bothers me, particularly with where we are in the country today.
I agree with you, but I think that is sort of that's a phenomenon that began in the 80s, that we celebrated that sort of very high-priced lifestyle. And there are plenty of people that are comfortable with it, right? And want that mansion, and they want the most expensive car that they can have, and they want to spend as much money as they can. And the way the economy is set up, that there's a good living to be made, or good businesses to be created by serving just that pretty small segment of the population. So
they're recession-proof.
Yeah, right. So,
This is your third book.
Yes.
But you've written many, many articles, and you were a former editor of the Philadelphia Magazine.
That's right. Yeah, it's been for about a decade. I was the editor. Yeah.
You must have enjoyed that. That was quite a magazine. Yeah,
it really was fascinating. It was a fascinating way to sort of observe what was happening in Philadelphia, and I love the fact that it was about Philadelphia, but it was about many things within Philadelphia.
Yeah, it did. But back in the day, when Mayor Rizzo and so on, that era, Philadelphia Magazine kicked up a great deal more dust than it does today. It's almost tame compared to those days. Yeah,
they were really well known for a lot of their investigative journalism, and that continues on to this day. It doesn't always get as much attention as I think it did back in the 70s and in that era. Maybe Frank Rizzo was a pretty fascinating character to write about, right?
I was in public relations at the time, and you had a real homer if you could get something in the Philadelphia Magazine, even a mention in the Philadelphia Magazine, for good or bad. It didn't make any difference. Right. Notoriety was as good as anything else. There was one article, though, that's referenced in your biography, and then the title was "My Daughter's 29,000 Appendectomy." I think these days we can all relate to something like that. Tell me the story, though.
So this happened, that story came out about 15 years ago. So my daughter was 5 at the time and was complaining of a stomach ache. And for a while we took her to the doctor. They said, oh, she has an appendicitis, get her to the hospital. So we went down to Children's Hospital in West Philadelphia. And they said, yeah, her appendix needs to come out. They took it out. She was fine. The bill came at some point down the road, and the bill was for $29,000. Now, fortunately, we had health insurance. It covered most of that. I paid whatever the deductible was, and we went on our way, and she was fine. But as weeks passed, I started to think, how could that be $29,000? And I tried to look at the itemized bill, and it didn't make any sense. So I thought, I'm going to sort of just investigate why this supposedly cost $29,000. So I went back and I interviewed people at the insurance company, my doctor, and people in the hospital, trying to get to the bottom of this. And it just was amazing to me how no one understood this system at all. And my favorite part of the story was interviewing her surgeon, who in my mind was God. He had sort of, saved my daughter from what had happened to her. And he looked at the bill and like he had never seen this before. He had no idea how much his time costs. He had no idea how much the sutures he was using to stitch her up costs. And this was all sort of news to him. And it just, to me, was about just how impenetrable the healthcare system was then, and I think it's equally impenetrable right now. So, I mean, that was a story that got a lot of reaction because I think, as you said, people can really relate to this. Like, we just get a bill, and you're like, I guess I have to pay this, right?
Well, when I saw it, it reminded me of something quite current. I have, what did I get? I got shots in my back, right? And I don't normally, but I started paying attention to the summary of benefits that I get from my insurance company. And my God, it was one visit. Forget about that procedure. One visit had 4 pages of little mini charges, $4, $12, $15, different codes and so on. But I mentioned to the doctor who did the injection, I said, according to this, that's a $10,000 procedure. I'm in here for an hour and a half. I'm in and out.
Right.
$10,000? And he said, first of all, I don't get paid $10,000. Secondly, I have no idea what the costs are. To your point, it hasn't changed. He has no idea what the charges were, no idea how it was charged, no idea what part of it was covered by insurance, et cetera, et cetera. In the end, I didn't have to pay anything. But I didn't know how I got from that to not having to pay anything.
That's exactly the point. And the other thing, I'm sort of remembering this now, is that no one was paid $29,000 for my daughter's appendix. I mean, the insurance company paid the hospital and the doctor whatever they paid them.
It's a silly game.
$10,000, yeah. But part of the other thing I wrote about in that story was, this was particularly at a time when we were talking about, well, medicine, we ought to think about it as a consumer product, and a smart shopper will shop around. And I thought, well, I wasn't going to go shopping when my daughter was bent over in pain. I was going to pay whatever it costs to have her appendix removed, right? So we should stop talking about things as consumer products that actually aren't. I mean, if you want to have elective surgery to get, some wrinkles removed, sure, that's one thing. But emergency surgery is something very, very different.
Yeah, you're right. And you're caught. You're caught in the moment.
Yeah, what are you going to do, right?
Yeah. You're at their mercy. This is your 3rd book. Is there a 4th in the offing?
I have some ideas that I'm starting to do some research on, but nothing I can talk about yet. But
okay.
Yeah, I'm excited because the world is a complicated, fascinating place. So I would love to keep writing about it.
Then this opened other possibilities for you?
There's so many different ideas in here that it's sort of, and this happens a lot even too with magazine articles, that one thing you're writing about, there's a little nugget in there that might be a paragraph in that story, but leads you to something else completely. So
tell me about your newsletter, Common Good.
So it's a newsletter I've started on Substack. I started earlier this year, and it really is just a way to sort of talk about things that I have worked on, either books or magazine articles, but also I will have the occasional thought or commentary about what's going on in the world. And the reason I called it Common Good is that I think a lot of what's happened to us over the last few decades is that we don't think about our country holistically anymore. I think about what's good for me. I don't think about how that might impact you or somebody else. I don't think it's because we're terrible people. I think it's just the way the culture has evolved that says, think about yourself first. And I think part of the struggles that we're having these days politically, culturally, sort of flow from that. And if we could think a little bit more holistically about these things, that we'd actually all feel better and that the country would run a little bit better if we could think bigger picture about things.
Thank you very much. My guest today has been Tom McGrath, author of Triumph of the Yuppies, available on the internet and in most good bookstores. Thank you very much for being here.
Thanks, Rick.
Really enjoyed it. Until next time, I'm Rick Anthony. This is 30 Minutes. Take very good care of yourselves